In Overwatch 2, there are many mistakes that you are making no matter what role you play. So in this video, we're going to be breaking down 3 huge mistakes that you make for each role. But if you want to know the exact mistakes that you're making that is preventing you from hard carrying games and climbing, my Patreon is open so you can go book a one-on-one or a recorded VOD and you can find out exactly what you need to improve on and the mistakes that you need to stop making so that you can climb. Links will be in the description down below. Now, if you want to jump to your specific role, the timestamp will be in the description. But if you jump to just one, do me a favor and smash that subscribe because, you know, the percentage of watched video is going to be abysmal, but it's worth it for that fat sub. But let's jump right in to the tank role. Now, the first and most important mistake that tank players are making a bit too much, and it's actually focusing too much on just the other tank. Now, I know you are supposed to be the one that is preventing the enemy tank from making plays, holding that front line, and taking space. However, if you're having trouble climbing as tank and you can't have enough impact to win games, it's because you're not making any plays on the tank. Let's take Zarya for instance. Oftentimes, you want to build up charge on that front line, prevent the enemy tank from pushing up onto your team, but eventually, when you have high charge and high bubbles, you're going to see a key opportunity to go make an aggressive play on the enemy supports in the backline or even their DPS. A really great Zarya will often actually make a very proactive either semi-flank play or just pushing past the enemy tank to go kill an enemy squishy, and Zarya needs to see those key opportunities. And every tank is like this where they really want to make a play at some point. They can't just stay the entire game just sitting on the front line being this incredibly passive player. Sure, you're holding space and you're supporting your team and maybe preventing the enemy tank from making plays somewhat, but the problem here is that you're not going to carry any games, and if your DPS suck, then you're probably just going to lose. And if your DPS are awesome, you're going to win, but you want more actual impact in your games. So you need to learn how to have that key aggressive temperament that allows you to make these plays on tank. And it's incredibly important that you balance the two between defending the front line, occupying that space, and defending your team from the enemy tank, and also looking for key opportunities where you can go real quick, make a play, get a pick, and then come back to your team. Now, the second biggest mistake that tank players are making, and this one is so freaking huge, guys, and it's not considering your support's line of sight or effective healing range. If you are a Winston and you have 2 supports, let's say you have a Mora and a Bap, and you jump all the way to the enemy backline, neither of these characters are going to realistically be able to heal you. They have very close effective healing ranges, and on top of that, if you turn the corner, whether you're on any tank, Zarya, Rhine, whatever the case may be, if you have someone that needs line of sight to heal you, like an Ana, they can't heal you when you turn that corner. So it's not only important to take note of what supports you have, but how can you play in their effective range and line of sight so that you can actually get a decent amount of heals, because way too many tanks will push way too far ahead of their supports. They'll push outside of their range, and you expect your support to literally chase after you to come heal you. It's realistically not going to happen. And even if they do, it leaves them super vulnerable for a potential play by the enemy. And you might go get some value, but then your support dies and you lose the fight because of it. So please take this into consideration. It's really going to help you climb, and make sure that you're not going for too big of a play when you don't have any support. Now, as a slight follow-up to this also happens when tanks try to do like a huge ultimate, like a grab around the corner or a shatter that shatters the entire enemy team, but your team is way back behind and they can't see it. If you don't have DPS or characters that can follow up some sort of giant CC move, you need to make sure that you are not going to die as you cast it, and you're going to be able to get substantial value in it by yourself. And that's a really different call to make, rather than, I don't care if I die, I can throw this because I know I have someone that will follow up. Very different scenarios, and your ultimate use should reflect that. Now, the last big mistake that tank players make so often is they don't give up space based on advantage. Now, I know that you have to contest objectives and you want to make sure to touch before the enemy caps an objective, but the most important thing a tank can do is giving space when they have to give space. And you might be asking, what do I mean by giving space? Okay, let's take King's Row on defense, right? If your tank is on that point, but maybe you lost 1 support early or 1 DPS early, it's important that you don't force the fight to be a 5v4, because as a tank, you get to dictate that fight. If you go in as a tank and push aggressively or don't back up when the enemy comes to take the space, the team fight will 100% happen. It will be forced to happen, because if you die, the fight's over. So it's really important that you need to understand that it's okay to back up. It's okay to give ticks. It's okay to basically give the enemy space so that you and your team don't die, waiting for a mistake by over-aggression from the enemy team where y'all can even that playing field, or waiting for ultimates because you could turn a numbers disadvantage, or waiting for a regroup before you go and try to contest. The key here is to contest before the enemy actually takes the point, and as a tank, you make the call whether or not it's possible to retake or not. Because if you try to retake a point that's not possible, you could end up dying and losing another team fight for free, giving way more percentage, the enemy gets tons more ultimate, and they could potentially snowball you. So as the tank, there's a lot riding on your shoulders strategically, and you have to really decide, is a fight winnable? Can I give up space here? Should we take this fight? And there's a lot that needs to be going through your brain, because at the end of the day, if your DPS think that they should fight the fight and you think no, if you're already out of there, your DPS aren't going to be winning that fight. And it's really important to understand that your teammates will often reflect what you're doing, even if not intentional. So definitely keep these things in mind. Now we move on to DPS, a role that you're making huge mistakes on, and it's really preventing you from climbing. And that goes double for anyone under the Masters rank. These are so damn important. Number one is overly focusing on the tank. This is one of the biggest changes from Overwatch 1 to Overwatch 2, and I find this most often with players that played a lot of Overwatch 1 and are trying to adapt to the new system. Tanks are very, very freaking hard to kill. Not only are they physically stronger, but they give you less ultimate charge, they can't be CC'd or crowd controlled, and they have two supports that get to pump all their healing into one tank. So they're basically not gonna die. So you're like, all right, as a DPS, I can't shoot this tank. What do I do? Well, the big thing that you need to do is try and make plays on the enemy DPS and support. Oftentimes, you want to exist with your tank, prevent the enemy tank from taking too much ground and just being able to walk into your team for free. But you constantly need to be thinking about plays that you could be making that actually get you real impact, which is kills. How can you get kills? How can you make a play that ends up in a kill? And looking at where the enemy is positioned, looking at where the DPS are going and where they're playing, and playing to your character's strengths. There's a lot of ways that you could play Tracer and go get a pick. You could play Genji and capitalize on a key opportunity. You could play Soldier and go on an alternate flank. You could play Sojourn and try to get a railgun shot on someone that has terrible movement in the back line. These are the plays that matter. But way too often, and I've been doing a lot more VOD reviews recently, and I've been watching DPS players in Plat and Gold. They're just focusing non-stop on these tanks in the front line. You could shoot a Rhine all day and you're never going to kill him. You could shoot a Zarya all day, and unless you're a select number of characters like Bastion and Junkrat and maybe Reaper, there's nothing you could do to this character. But if you go and make a proactive play on the enemy backline, you kill a support, you see a key opportunity to go for this off-angle pick on an enemy DPS. These are the ways in which you can have impact that actually will carry a fight, rather than just wasting your time focusing on a tank that will literally never die and you doing ultimately nothing throughout the course of a game. Now, number two is going for these all or nothing plays, which is kind of weird, right? Because I just said that you should be going for these plays. However, it's important that if you go too aggressively for a play, you try to force a play through, right? But you end up dying, the enemy didn't really have to do anything proactive in order to win the fight. You gave them a kill. If you solo dash into 3 people as Genji, hoping that you can somehow one-tap them all and you die, you gave them a free kill and they didn't have to do anything meaningful. All they had to do is protect themselves with you feeding into them. It's important that you, one, give yourself an out. Think about how you're going to engage an enemy. What is the chances of that being successful? And what is your out if it doesn't go right? If you're a Cassidy, for instance, rolling out into the enemy backline, hoping that you're going to hit like 3 dinks, that's pretty freaking all or nothing, right? However, playing the high ground, poking a bit, killing one person or getting someone to low before you commit, that means that the play is more likely to be successful. There are certain triggers that you should look at and see that give you the go-ahead I should commit to this, I should keep poking, I should soft commit with the way out. There's always different levels to how far you should go with the play, but the most important thing is not allowing the enemy to get a free pickoff or free value on you simply because you went for a really high risk, high reward play that had no indicators that it had a good chance of succeeding, and then the enemy gets to win the fight for basically free. Now, before we get to that third DPS tip, we are almost at 30,000 subscribers, so if you like the content, consider smashing that sub because I'm going to do some sick giveaway when we hit 30K, and I'm pretty sure we're going to hit it very soon. Now, moving on to the third mistake for DPS players, and it's trying to do it all alone. Now, I understand as a DPS player, oftentimes you feel like the game is on your shoulders. You want to go in, you want to pop off and carry, and you feel like you have to do that, so you're constantly trying to force these plays through. And while I did say it's important for you to find these plays and go for them in order to carry, it's also important that you utilize your teammates' position and pressure to enable your plays to work more successfully. Let's say there's two scenarios, both where you're Genji and the enemy support is isolated. Now, let's say your team is regrouping and that enemy support is isolated. You go for them, but you don't have a very big window of time to pull off that play before that person gets peeled from their team. If they're isolated enough and you're confident enough in your playmaking ability, you can still pull it off potentially, but it's so much more difficult than in a separate scenario where your team is actively fighting the enemy team and the enemy is having a lot of their attention directed towards your team, and they are also using their cooldowns and your team is doing some amount of damage. Now, in that same isolated support situation, you have more time to pull off that play. Your play is going to go better because your teammates are positioned aggressively and in the fight, and there's more pressure being generated overall. Essentially, as a general rule of thumb, the more your teammates are actually involved in the fight overall, the much greater the margin for error that you have on your own plays. And that's why, unless you're mechanically on point or you catch an enemy completely by surprise, going for a true solo play is very risky and hard to do. I'm not saying to never do them, but evaluate that risk versus reward and keep in mind that it's so much easier to set up unfair matchups instead. Matchups where you're actually just in a 2v1 scenario or a 3v1, or you see a one-on-one between one of your DPS and a support and you just jump in to just close that out right away. Don't give the enemy time to get peeled. Don't give the enemy time to maybe even win the fight. Just close it out. And you're going to be able to see these situations if you're looking out for them on the battlefield. And you don't even have to coordinate with your team. You don't even have to set them up. They will appear automatically just by your teammates playing the game. And that's why it's incredibly important to just not be an all-mechanic, no-brain DPS player. Think about what your team is doing and how what they're doing can actually make your plays have a higher success rate. Now, moving on to the last but certainly not least role, we have the support. And the biggest mistake that support players make is actually being a heal bot. I think subconsciously, something that a lot of support players are actually worried about is missing a shot, not healing their team, or not bailing out a teammate when they need to be healed, and their team getting super pissed at them. You're a garbage support. You're a garbage healer. What are you doing? Why are you even playing this rank? They just get pissed off of you, right? Supports often, you are kind of the least recognized role oftentimes. You could be carrying fight after fight, hit insane sleeps, do something ridiculously remarkable, but you don't heal a teammate one time who needed heals, and all of a sudden your team is just flaming you to the end of the earth. And I understand maybe that gives you a little bit of anxiety, and maybe you pride yourself in being a support that gives all your super greedy DPS and tank players all the heals they need in the world. But I'm gonna tell you something. If you really want to climb, you need to stop babysitting your team. The weird thing is, there is a disconnect between what your DPS and tanks want from you and what you need to actually do to win games. And I know that seems really strange, right? But if you're a support that is doing anything besides constantly healing your team, you could get flack for it. You go for a crazy nade play, you go for an aggressive off angle on a Kiriko, you go for a super sick volley with a Zen, or you go try to DPS on Lucio for just a little second. Regardless of what you do, regardless of how you play, you could piss off your team unless you're literally being a heal bot. But here's the thing, heal botting doesn't really do that much. DPS are not as good as they think they are in your team, and they're not going to just carry you because you're constantly healing them. They think they will, and they want you to heal them, but they're not, and you're not going to climb. If you just fulfill this heal bot role, you will be the most liked support on the planet, and you will be hard stuck. I promise you. And that's the thing, is if you really want to climb, you gotta be okay with being unliked. You gotta be okay with getting flamed. And if you don't like it, you can always leave chat and turn off comms. But the reality of it is, if you want to make proactive plays that actually carry fights, you gotta be okay with messing up. You got to be okay with not fulfilling everything your team wants you to do. And you got to be okay with getting flamed a little bit. And I know it's a very weird concept, but it's so freaking true. I promise you, this is incredibly important. Now, to tie into that point, you need to be thinking about the utility you can get from your support characters that are non-healing. Healing is actually not that impactful outside of just being able to top people up and making sure your team doesn't die, which is really not anywhere near as strong as it used to be, where healing was incredibly broken in Overwatch 1. Now, you want to be making more plays with your utility. You want to be using and utilizing the parts of your kit that enable you and your team in ways that are not just healing. I think that the lower ranks in particular really ingrain in supports exactly how you shouldn't play. They say things like, stop DPSing. Why aren't you on heal? You're not healing enough. Stop doing this. Stop doing that. You need to do this exact thing. You need to be a literal heal bot, and I promise it will not work. Now, moving on to the second thing that support players are really messing up with, it's being too rigid in your ultimate use. Now, I know that this is a very difficult one to master, and honestly, I suck at this a lot. Being very rigid in my ultimate use is something that I'm not. I'm actually a little bit too flexible to the point where sometimes I just throw it out there and it doesn't really get a ton of value. But it's important as a support player to do and use ultimates that actually can just carry a fight outright. Sometimes it's best to wait for a combo, but you might not always have a combo, and sometimes it's not always best to do a combo based on a number of different factors, whether it's current advantage, enemy ultimates, your team ultimates, how long you have to wait for that combo. Tempo ultimates can just straight up win fights, whether you're beating in and speeding your team in aggressively, or you're using a trance to save your Zarya that's about to get grabbed. Even if the enemy's on Zarya and they could get grabbed, but you know that they're only at 60-70%, and you could just outright win the fight if you bail your Zarya out right now. But if you don't use trance right now to save your Zarya, then the enemy Zarya is definitely going to get grabbed. Maybe you're in a lost fight and you think you should regroup, but the enemy gets too aggressive and one of them is low, and you just out of nowhere just nano one of your teammates, or Kijugo rush or rally and turn a fight. I know that it's really frustrating to waste an ultimate, but I think it's even worse to never use it, just waiting around for that perfect situation. And if you really want to, I would consider going back into your own gameplay and taking note of the ultimates that maybe you thought you wasted, and think about ways in which you could have used that better next time. As long as your ultimate is getting legitimate value, or there was a play that you were trying to go for, specific play that you were trying to go for, I think it's fine to limit test a bit when you're trying to learn when and where you can use your ultimate, not just for, you know, that combo, but for more tempo-based purposes. Now, moving on to the third and final thing we got to talk about in this video, and it's about positioning on support, because it's one of the most important things if you want to live, which everyone in the game is trying to kill you. The tank, the Zarya is trying to freaking flank and kill you. The double DPS, they're coming for you. The Sombra's hacking you off cooldown. Even the damn supports are coming after you sometimes. So positioning is your safe haven, right? But it's hard because you can't always position the same place every single time. And the reason that is because the enemy's threats are different and how they're playing is different. There are some times where the enemy tracer is trying to duel your DPS all the time, and you can play a little bit closer to them, trying to bait them out or peel for them. But there are some times where you're the target of everyone on the enemy team, and you have to play very different depending on how that target is played out. If the enemy is like hard flanking with multiple divers, playing closer to your team is going to be far better than playing isolated. But if the enemy is trying to play on that front line and just slightly off angle, looking for a key opportunity to dink you or hit a little skill shot on you, then you might want to be playing further, even farther back outside of their effective range, but in your character's effective range, using natural cover in certain situations, and in other situations playing alone far away from the enemy team. There's a lot of factors that can change your positioning, but the number one thing I would suggest you do is take a note about what characters on the enemy team are going to try to make a play on you and how that's going to happen. Are they going to push through your front line? Are they going to go on the flank? Are they going to snipe you from range? How's it going to happen? And how can you position in a way that makes them harder to do that? That's the first thing. And the second thing is know the characters on your team that can help you if you're ever in a pickle. If you're in a trouble, what can your teammates do about it? Are there any of them that can? How aggressive you position and where you position is going to directly change on these two things. And of course, the map terrain as it moves. You always want to favor the high ground when possible, as long as you're not completely isolated, depending on what the enemy team is running. Always keep track of where the enemy characters are and where they're not. If they're not around, they're probably coming for you. And remember, if you don't die very often, you're probably, winning a lot. That's kind of how it is on support. Living is kind of the game. But if you want your own mistakes dug into and analyzed, I would highly suggest checking out my Patreon or going and just doing a self-VOD review, because you can learn a lot from just analyzing your own gameplay as well. But if you enjoyed the video, smash the like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.